Good morning and welcome to week 4 of the CMA Studios summer session. My name is Joyce Beyer and I'm excited to be here this morning to give you the inside scoop on some of the music being played by the Belin Quartet this week. Just a reminder before we get into the lesson, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to set those in the comments section and I'll get to them as soon as I can. And if you notice that there'd be someone who'd be interested in seeing this, go ahead and share it with them. The video will be available for the next week, so you can watch it even if you're not here on the live stream. Once we're done with the lesson, stick around because I have some information about a cool activity that we have for you and a chance to win some free tickets. But until that time, let's go on to the lesson. Okay, week 4, and it's time to talk about our goals for today. So let's start off with number 1. Number 1, by the end of today, I want you to be able to say, I can describe dynamics in music. Goal number 2, I want you to be able to say by the end of today, I can compare and contrast composers Bach, Beethoven, and Glazunov. Now, some of you might know some of these things already. Some of you might be pros. Some of you might not know anything that we're about to talk about. Wherever you are, that's okay. The goal is that you learn a little bit new by the end of this lesson. So let's start off with goal number 1. What are dynamics? When we talk about dynamics in music, I think the easiest thing to relate it to is our volume. How loud or soft are you? When you're listening to music, like on your computer, like maybe you are right now, you can turn up the volume, but we actually have to change what we're doing on our instrument to change our volume. I have a little diagram here of some of the very common dynamics that you see that go from softest to loudest. When we talk about softer dynamics, we're talking about piano. When we're talking about louder dynamics, we're talking about forte. And I think it's important to point out that forte actually means strong. So when we're talking about loud, it's not just about being loud, it's about having a really nice, full, strong sound. And then somewhere in the middle, we have our mezzo, our medium dynamics. And then on either end, we have pianissimo, which is like, it looks like piano. And we have fortissimo, which looks like forte, forte. And you can actually get dynamics that are even more soft and even more loud. Composers will put really crazy things. Sometimes I've seen ones that have just a bunch of Fs in a row, and it's like fortis, issimo, depending on how many Fs you see. So there's a huge range that we can do with dynamics. And the big reason we do this is to make it more interesting. If you think about it, like even the way that I'm talking to you right now, my voice kind of changes in volume. I don't talk like this with the same volume the entire time because then you would probably take a nap. It's not very interesting. And when we talk about personality, sometimes we talk about having like a dynamic personality. That means contrast, things that make it interesting. So when we're talking about dynamics, we're talking about those things that we just said, like the louds and the softs. So now let's talk about how we would make that happen on a string instrument. Obviously, I'm going to choose the viola to demonstrate it on. King of instruments. All right, so when we're talking about dynamics, like I said, we have to alter how we play in order to get those dynamics to come across. The biggest thing that we have to start off with is actually having a good setup, like holding things the right way. If you don't hold things the right way, it kind of gets in the way of being able to do all of the things that you want. So most of our dynamics come from the bow and how we hold it. You'll notice that the bow hold is kind of different from like anything else that we would hold. You don't just hold it like a fist. We have our fingers kind of nicely curved around. Even my thumb is curved when I hold the bow for the viola. And that gives me flexibility so that I can do a lot of different things with it. On top of being able to hold the bow well, we actually need to make sure that the bow is going the right direction. I know it sounds kind of silly, like how many directions could there be? But if you look at the way that my viola is set up, we have this bridge here, and we want the bow to stay parallel to the bridge, so never cross the bridge. So if you look at, when I play with a nice, beautiful straight bow, just a normal sound. But if I were to take my bow and make it so that it's crooked instead of straight, listen how that changes my sound. It's a very different sound. It's thinner, and I don't have the same control over it. So in order for us to even make changes, we have to start off with having that good sound. Now, after you have that good setup, Now we talk about what we change in our bow in order to create the different dynamics. So there are three big things that we can change. One is weight. Two is speed, which kind of relates to how much bow you're using. And three is the placement of the bow. So I'm going to talk about each one of them and give you a couple of demonstrations. And I'll use Twinkle Twinkle because we all know what that sounds like, so it's nice and familiar. So when I'm just playing normal, not really thinking about like loud or soft, kind of just in my maybe piano mezzo forte range. That's my like mezzo forte sound. If I wanted to make that sound louder, stronger, I need to add a little more weight. So more weight will make it sound louder. If I take away that weight and make it lighter, it'll be softer. The only thing I was changing was how heavy my arm was in that string. Because the more weight that you use, the louder it's going to be. You do have to be careful if you think about it and you just press it in. It doesn't sound very good. So it's all a balance. It does take a while to kind of figure it out, but it's fun to play with. So we talked about weight. Now if I go to change speed instead, so before I was using this speed of bow. If I were to make my bow go faster, it doesn't necessarily mean that my notes are going to go faster, but my arm is going to move more, so more bow is being used. It can make it sound a little louder. If I slowed my arm down, I use less bow, so naturally it's a little bit softer. The last thing I'm going to talk about is placement. So I already told you that our bow needed to stay parallel to the bridge. And I think I have a photo here that shows you that there are kind of different lanes that we could be in. And so normally I'm about in the middle of where my fingerboard, this part here, and my bridge are. I try to stay pretty close. If I move way over the fingerboard, that's our normal sound. Way over the fingerboard. It doesn't vibrate as well. You notice I have holes right here, and this is how our sound naturally gets amplified. If we're playing directly over them, it works a little bit better. If we play over the fingerboard, which sometimes we do for an effect, kind of a different type of sound, it makes it softer. If you play right a little bit closer to the bridge, you can also make it louder, but you have to be careful because if you get too close to the bridge, we get this cool sound called ponticello. Kind of sounds like alien noises. But all of these things come from the bow. Being able to manipulate what you're doing with your hand and with the bow on your instrument totally changes the way that our instruments sound. So as you're listening to the music and you're hearing things change, I want you to kind of take a look at what people's bows are doing, because there's a lot of thought that goes into it and a lot of practice. So you might notice that sometimes they're using really big full bows, or sometimes they're moving their bow to a slightly different part of their instrument to try and get a different kind of sound. I think it's really interesting and something that makes dynamics fun to learn about, because there's a lot of ways that you can play around with your own instrument to figure out the type of sound that you want to get. So we talked about goal number one, dynamics, the things that make our music more interesting. Time to talk about the people who created the music. So I'm going to stretch it out. I like moving around, keeps me awake and alert. So now let's go on to meet our composers. Just a quick review. So we're going to talk about Bach, Beethoven, and Glazunov. If you don't know what a composer is, let's review that for you. Some of you probably already know, but a composer is someone who creates music, writes music. We use the term composes music. So we talk about these composers because knowing a little bit more about them and their lives and when they lived, I think tells you a little bit more about the music that you're going to hear and the types of things that would be normal for the music that they create. So let's start with a classic, Johann Sebastian Bach. If you've been listening to this series throughout the summer, we've already talked about him before, and he's a pretty important guy. He lived from 1685 to 1750, and he's from Germany. He spent most of his life in Germany, didn't move around a whole lot, and Germany is located in Europe, kind of the central part of Europe. From He composed during the Baroque era, and the Baroque era is something that we very closely associate with Bach. When Bach died, the Baroque era ended. That's how important he was to this era of music. So when we hear his music, we kind of expect certain things because of when it was written. If we want to go on to talk about some more fun facts about Bach, something I think is pretty interesting is a lot of his music was stuff that he either wrote for like the churches that he was working at, or they were for people who paid him, like wealthy patrons. And the piece that you're going to hear with this Belin Quartet concert is called a Brandenburg Concerto. It's one of his most famous pieces. And these were written for a person who was very famous and associated with Brandenburg. I learned while like looking at stuff about this, usually patrons would like pay the musicians for this music. I don't think Bach ever got paid for these ones. I don't think they like gave him money, which is kind of rude. But anyway, the music got created and now it's some of the stuff that he's most famous for. Another fun fact about Bach, he had 20 kids. Yes, 20 kids. He also came from a huge family. A lot of them were musicians, and some of his kids even became musicians. And then he wrote a ton of music, over 1,100 different pieces. But something that's pretty interesting is those pieces weren't for quartet. Like when we talk about Bach, we're not normally talking about string quartet music, even though you are going to hear a string quartet play it. A lot of these pieces were actually created for a small chamber orchestra or for solo instruments, or they were for like voice and choirs. And we've created arrangements that a string quartet can play because his music was so famous and because people really like it. So we talked about Bach. He lived the earliest of the three composers that we're going to talk about today. Let's move on now to Beethoven. I think another very, very famous composer, Ludwig van Beethoven. He was born in 1770, so he was born a little bit after Bach died, and he lived until 1827. He was born in Germany, like Bach, but he ended up moving to Vienna, which is in Austria. So again, stayed in that like middle of Europe, which a lot of our composers are from. He is known for writing classical music, but something that's kind of interesting about him is, so he started writing in classical music, but the things that he did, he actually started to push the boundaries of his time and take us more into what we consider romantic music. He started adding more instruments to ensembles. He would do like really crazy things with dynamics, which we talked about, to make things more interesting and kind of push what an instrument could or couldn't do. I think it's part of why he's so famous is because of the things that he did with the music. It's just more than what people around him were doing at the time. Some more fun facts about Beethoven. I don't know if this one's very fun, but it's something that's really important about him. He went deaf over the course of his life, and it was a big struggle for him. Music was what he did. It was his life. And so there was a time when he realized he was going deaf, and it really was so hard for him. But what I think is so cool is after he lost his hearing completely, he still wrote music. So some of his most famous pieces of music, things like the theme Ode to Joy is from one of his symphonies, his last symphony. He wrote that piece and he never heard how it sounded. And this is a huge piece. It involves a full orchestra. It involves a full choir. And he was able to, just based on how good of a musician he was, he could hear those parts in his head. He could hear the voices. He knew how things would sound together. I've heard that he played the piano, so he would take the legs off of his piano and set it on the floor and sit with it because he could feel the vibrations of the music. So I think that's just really inspiring when I think about Beethoven and how good of a musician he must have been to be able to create music without being able to hear it. That's just amazing. Looking at the types of things that he wrote 16 string quartets, more string quartets than Bach wrote, because Bach didn't really write for string quartets. And he also played the violin and the piano. Like those were some of the main instruments that he played. An interesting fact I found out, apparently he didn't actually know his own birth date. He thought that instead of being born in 1770, he thought he was born in 1772. And people think that it was probably because he was one of these kids that at a young age, he was good at music. And so people think that his dad actually lied about when he was born. because making him seem younger would make him seem better when he was traveling around and writing music. So a little bit interesting. Beethoven, apparently, this is the like 250th anniversary of his birthday. So I think it's cool that you're getting to hear some music by him because he definitely was a very influential composer. Okay, we talked about two. We actually have three composers today. So we talked about Bach, we talked about Beethoven. Now we're going to talk about a composer that I don't think as many people know about. He lived after Beethoven, and his name was Alexander Glazunov. Kind of a fun name to say, Glazunov. He was born in 1865, so well after Beethoven had died, and he died in 1936. He's from Russia. I think this is the first composer in the series that we're talking about that was from Russia. He was very proud of being Russian. He composed in the late Romantic era of music, and some people refer to it as like the Russian Romantic music. He's very well known for that. He played the piano, like so many of our composers, and he started composing by the time he was 11, and by the time he was 16, he already had orchestras that were premiering his works, which is cool. I did not accomplish that by the time I was 16. I think my greatest musical accomplishment at 16 was playing in all-state orchestra, not having professional orchestras play my music. So that's very cool that he was able to do that. A little bit more about Glazunov. He also was a conductor, which I think a lot of composers, once they compose their music, they were asked to come and be conductors for orchestras, because theoretically, if you compose the music, you should know how to direct the orchestra to be able to play it better. But I also read, apparently he wasn't a very good composer. Not everyone liked having him be their their conductor. So he would get up and he wasn't the clearest for people to follow, which is kind of interesting. He worked at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, which is a big school. He was a teacher there, and then he became the director. And that was happening during 1905, the Russian Revolution, and also World War I. So those are some of the big like landmarks in history that happened around the time that Glazunov was around and teaching. And then something that's different about Glazunov versus some of the other composers we talked about, he wrote for the saxophone. The saxophone actually wasn't invented until middle of the 1800s. And even when it was first invented, composers didn't write for it so much. We as string players, we kind of lucked out. We were some of the very first instruments to exist. And so all of these composers have written a ton of music for us. Glazunov actually wrote for saxophone, a later instrument too, and he wrote a big saxophone concerto that he's well known for. So we talked about these three composers. They're very different in terms of when they lived. Each composer, they didn't overlap when they lived. After Bach died, then Beethoven was born. After Beethoven died, then Glazunov was born. So their music will sound pretty different just because of that. They all are from like the greater Europe area, with Glazunov being from Russia. And so I think it's kind of interesting that they're all paired up because their music should sound so different, even though they were not too far away from each other and where they lived. So let's talk about that music then. Comparing the music that you're going to hear this week with the Belin Quartet. The first thing you'll hear is the Brandenburg Concerto, number 3, movement 3. And that is by Bach. This is a really, really fun piece. It's very fast. And one of the things I like about it is you're going to hear this main melody played by, I think it probably starts with the first violin, but you're going to hear that passed around the entire orchestra, or in this case, the string quartet. So as you're listening, listen for that first melody that you hear, because it's going to come back again and again and again throughout the whole thing. When we go on to our next piece, you're going to hear a string quartet by Beethoven. And just like the other string quartets that you've heard so far, there are 4 movements. You'll notice that this time there is a minuetto, which we've had in literally all of the quartets so far, but this time it's going to be in the second movement instead of the third. But these names of the different movements, they tell us how fast or how slow it's going to go. So first movement is allegro, fast, lively. Second movement is a minuetto. Third movement is andante cantabile, so slow, singing, beautiful. Fourth movement is allegro, so fast and lively again. Something that makes Beethoven quartets a little different from, say, like a Mozart quartet or some of the other earlier composers, his music, I think, starts to give better I don't know if better is the right word. They give more roles to the other instruments that are in the string quartet. So I, as a violist, I really appreciate it because when you start getting to people like Beethoven, the viola has a bigger role as opposed to just being the support character. So that's kind of fun to listen to. And then you'll get to hear the 5 novelettes by Glazunov. Something that's kind of cool about these, apparently the 5 different movements, they all represent kind of a different culture or area of the world. So they're written based on music that you would stereotypically hear from there. So there's one that is from Spanish origin. There's one that is about Asia. There's one about Hungary. And then there's some about Russia as well, which makes sense because that's where Glazunov was from. So a lot of different music that you're going to hear this week from several very cool composers. Now that we've talked about that, though, let's go back and make sure that we hit our goals for today. So goal number 1 was, I can describe dynamics in music. We talked about that. What we need to do to make our instruments sound loud versus soft actually takes a lot of work on the part of the musician. So it's really interesting that when you hear these things, to kind of watch what the musician is doing too and see how they change their bow to make those differences. Number 2, I can compare and contrast composers Bach, Beethoven, and Glazunov. They lived at very different times, and I think when you listen to their music, you're going to hear a lot of differences in the type of music that you're hearing too. Thanks so much for joining us. Hope you learned something new today. All right. Well, thanks so much for listening to the lesson. Now it's time to talk about the activity that we have for you. So if you want to check out the fun game of Kahoot that we have prepared, head over to the Civic Music website and click on Education. We have directions on how to log on to Kahoot and get to our game. And just a reminder, if you take a photo of yourself playing the game or finishing it, you can send that to info@civicmusic.org for a chance to win a family pack of tickets. After you're done with that, be sure to check out the Belin Quartet concert tomorrow at 6 p.m. The same way that you're watching this, you can find it on Facebook or on YouTube. So we hope to see you there. Thanks so much for joining us.